So why don't we just each go around and have each of you describe what it is that you do.
I'll start. Last in, first up. So I'm Galia. I work with Bancor Protocol. We're trying to promote a standard that allows cryptocurrencies to be automatically convertible for each other directly through their smart contracts outside of exchanges at an algorithmically calculated rate. What we hope that this does is open up the door for what we call the long tail of user-generated currencies. So currencies really need to be liquid and to be stable in order to be usable by regular people and by communities. So that's Bancor.
Hi, so I'm Cassat. I'm Chief Strategy Officer of ConsenSys. You probably know what ConsenSys is if you're here. But we're comprised of a lot of sub-projects. We're a venture studio. In that venture studio, I do a lot of work mentoring and selecting the different startups that we engage with and support in the ecosystem. And I also try to make sure that we're living in line with ConsenSys's vision, which is to construct a very inclusive new type of economy. And I try to make sure that we are a beacon of that in the world. So I'm happy to be on this panel.
Matt Mckibbin. I've founded a couple of different companies in this space, starting with Ubiquity, title transfer, D10E, if you've ever been to the D10E conferences, decentralized. And now I'm working with a new company that we just founded called DecentraNet, which is bringing blockchain projects to life, similar to a kind of venture studio, doing consulting, advising, and it basically allows us to work on the projects that we really feel passionate about. One of which that we're starting to work on now is creating governance, like jurisdictions, our own special economic zone jurisdictions, to allow for everyone in the world to have governance services that they may need. And I can talk a little bit more about that on the panel.
Hi, I'm Sheila Warren. I am the head of blockchain and distributed ledger technology at the World Economic Forum. I'm based here in San Francisco at our Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And what Wes is trying to do is really work on pilot policy projects that will facilitate the adoption of blockchain for social good. So bringing together industry and government, civil society to ensure that as this technology continues to permeate throughout the entire ecosystem of the world, it is harnessed in ways that can benefit society.
Okay, so why don't we talk about with this phrase global inclusive economy. I want you guys to define it and also describe how your project contributes to creating that vision. And we can really go in any order. It doesn't have to be like, this order. So should we do heads first?
Okay. All right. So global inclusive economy. I mean, so with the advent of blockchains and you say the internet of money or the internet of value, we now have a trust or a layer that we don't need to trust other humans on to do our finances and our money and our decentralized applications, our smart contracts, that allows us to do that in a borderless fashion. And so the global inclusive economy would be the economy that will be shifted onto this internet of value and laws and finance that we are creating separate from and connecting to the legacy financial system. And that includes governance applications and anything that we build on top of this layer.
So I could say a bit about what that means to me. I think the biggest number that sticks out to me is there are 2.5 billion people on the planet that, according to the UN, don't have an identity. They don't have a piece of paper that says who they are, and therefore they can't open a bank account. They can't access some government services. They probably, if they don't have that piece of paper, can't pay the $10,000 or $100,000 of lawyer fees that would be necessary in order to build the structure to fund a company, to do a small-scale project, to execute a contract in order to accomplish something or to participate in the global economy. So when we have projects like ConsenSys's Uport or MetaMask or various projects that provide people identity, and we also then couple that with things like Open Law, which is a project we're working on that allows basically a hybrid between smart contracts, Ethereum code, and actual normal law jurisprudence. It basically makes available and makes nearly free something that would normally not be accessible to 2.5 billion people. Not only can they have bank accounts, but they could have something that I would normally need to pay a lawyer to draft. And not only would I need to pay a lawyer to draft, I would need a court system, a government that is well-functioning, not corrupt, and capable of the jurisprudence necessary to do that. When people look at what country I want to put a company in, for instance, part of what they're looking at is how developed is the court system, how stable is the court system, how stable will my business be therefore. And so we have a decentralized global network capable of accomplishing those same things that's available to everyone and both in practice and in price. I think that's what it means to me.
Yeah, and building on that, I think to me, the term requires some discussion of intentionality. And so we know that traditional banking, financial, and monetary systems somewhat unapologetically exclude vast swaths of the population of the earth. And building on what Sam was talking about, with blockchain, we have an opportunity, and with crypto for that matter, to very intentionally be inclusive of populations that historically have not had access to things like a public record system, identity, let alone a currency or a monetary system that can actually support them in their daily endeavors.
For us, the global inclusive economy means more money for more people. And also the economic freedom to accept whatever currency you choose for your time and your labor and your skills. So we envision a world where community leaders or different groups can form their own networks and create their own currencies, and these currencies are inherently interoperable with all the other currencies being created.
So something that's interesting to me is all the things that you guys described are services that governments typically provide, right? They give you your identity, they give you your legal system, they give you your currency. So are we going to see blockchains replace government someday?
I'll bite on that a little bit. If you look at the structure of our governments right now, the structure, even representative democracy, it reflects from a reality that's not really true anymore. So, for instance, one of the reasons why in the U.S. we have representative democracy is because if I want to know what the wealthy landowner down the street thinks, he would have to ride on a horse or send someone on a horse, and they would come tell me, and then we can make decisions. So, a lot of the artifacts of our government are a reflection of the limitations of the technology that was being used to transmit information, to make decisions, et cetera. And so, blockchain has the ability to do a lot of those same things. It has the ability to do it across borders. It has the ability to do things like provide identity. And I think we might see a little bit of a trend of where, as I was just saying, normally you would need hundreds of years of development of the jurisprudence of a country and their court system, et cetera, in order to affect what a business needs. Now we can do that for free, and now we can do that in a context that is not administrated by a government. And so what does that mean? It probably means that the role of government will change a little bit, and the way that value flows through our economy and our society will be less necessary to go towards government and more necessary towards other structures that achieve the same effect.
So I want to give you all a chance to answer that, but I also just want to throw in another question, which is obviously many of you are working with governments. When you do that, do they seem to feel threatened by this or no?
Yeah, I can jump on that one. I think it's important to recognize that for many governments, not all governments, some governments excluded for sure, there's a recognition that we're in a time of the erosion of public trust in institutions. And that's not just government, it's media, it's just variously public institutions that don't command respect and trust the way they used to. And so Bill Tai earlier spoke about Hernando de Soto and some of the work around land titling and records. That was a government-driven project or highly government-supported project because the governments in Honduras, the Republic of Georgia, they've understood that one of the keys to having a robust economy is having security in your land ownership and in titling. And so that is ordinarily a recorder's office function, but it was willingly outsourced to blockchain by governments there. So I think it's function by function, and I think that at least at the initial step, we're seeing a lot of governments come to the forum really interested in engaging with blockchain. It's one of the hottest topics for governments right now because they understand it can bolster and support trust because of what it is.
But I wonder, is that also because maybe you're helping them with like a private blockchain rather than, like, do you guys that are working on some of the more public things feel like governments seem threatened by what you're doing?
So mine's a little bit off. I don't think they're threatened. I think what we're doing is we're using a framework for special economic zones. And so for people that aren't familiar with special economic zones, they're zones that are literally carved out by the parent country so that you can create your own types of economic rules there that allow people to prosper. So for example, in China, they started doing special economic zones and it brought 400 million people out of poverty in the past 30, 40 years. That's a lot of people. So these types of frameworks that you can carve out to have your own types of build your own adaptive governance rules are really important. Taking that to the next step, if you were going to create your own special economic zone now, you're probably not going to have a DMV for your identity service. You're going to have a framework for identity dApps to plug in. You don't know necessarily which identity dApp is going to be the best for identity, or the best for dispute resolution, or the best for property registration, but there are a number of them out there. And so building frameworks for governance operating systems in the new systems is what we're trying to do. So governments can profit from that in some sense, but we understand that the DMV is not something that is very highly efficient that we want to have in a new type of system.
For us, we work less on the government layer and more on the money layer. Money, of course, is the holy grail, right? And it's one of the things that governments care the most about as far as their centralization, maybe governments, maybe violence, the militaries that we have. And so we definitely feel that we're at the edge of where a transition is going to be painful for some folks. And we talked about this in the morning, but if you look at money over time, we kind of have these three eras of money that we like to think about. When money came from the earth, gold, salt, and oil, things we could quantify and we knew how hard they were to extract. Then we had money come from governments, so governments print our money, whether it's paper or digital. And now we're entering this third era where money comes from the people. Bitcoin is a user-generated currency. Ethereum is a user-generated currency. And if we look at how some of these transitions have happened, let's say in information, we used to have the government be the source of information, right? Maybe one broadcast channel or maybe one newspaper. And today we have YouTube. And so we have this long tail of the ability to broadcast yourself and get your opinions out there. It doesn't mean that we don't still have information coming from the government. So we don't see it so much as an either or, it's a both and, but just the presence of these user-generated platforms put pressure on the old model. They essentially break the monopoly and they force the old model to compete.
So I would say I haven't seen too much resistance or being scared. I see different speeds of movement. For sure. Some, especially emerging market countries, would very much like to do things that would spur on economic development and are fast to move. And maybe the machinery of government moves a little bit faster too because it's less weighted down by a process that's been developed for hundreds of years. But I would say there's a lot of open arms of government actually. So for instance, we've done a lot of really interesting work in Dubai. There's a mandate that by 2020, all relevant government processes and transactions need to be on blockchain, and we've been very happy to work with them on that. And I think that they believe that this is a way to dramatically increase the efficiency of the services they offer as a government to their citizens. I think you've seen, even before blockchain, countries like Estonia offering e-residency, and I think that speaks to your earlier question, Laura, about what is the useful administrative unit of government? Where is the border drawn? In Estonia's case, they're willing to offer government services that have no border, right? It's just a digital open border. So I think that if you talk to regulators right now, most of them are in the position where they really do see the promise of this technology. They understand a lot of the nuance of this technology and are really trying to strike this balance of let's make sure that our country, our jurisdiction can capitalize upon the efficiencies and the innovation happening here. And at the same time, they have a mandate to protect their citizens. And so everyone that I've seen in the regulatory environments around the world has truly been trying to strike that balance, and I give them a lot of credit for that.
And I also wanted to ask, so, we're talking more at the high level of the government level, but on the ground, what does it look like trying to create a global inclusive economy using blockchains? I just don't know, technology-wise, or maybe culturally, there might be some challenges there.
I mean, so working on the ground, one of the things we want to do is create kind of a social impact or social entrepreneurial test ground to go apply some of these social impact problems there. You really need someone to work with as a partner on the ground to implement new solutions no matter what you're doing. You have to have the local culture, the local perspective. A lot of times financial institutions, a couple of the companies we advise can be that kind of, the banks can change their role to be maybe a trusted fiduciary co-signer in some way to implement the applications on the ground. Otherwise, I mean, you can't just drop an iPad off and say, govern yourselves, right? It doesn't work that way, so.
And so what do you need to do? I imagine there's challenges
It's community building, right? So you have to build a community of people that think and share the values and know how to use it and why it's there. You can't just, if you have a money app to people that have never used online money before, there's a long curve, there's a curve of people that need to learn how to use just the basic technologies and apps before they can even do that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point that, every market, every country, every culture is different. And it's important that, we can sit here and we can talk about how interesting this technology is, but the only way that you are not just kind of being a technological imperialist or maybe an idealist is to really go and be there and understand from that country how governance works, how people think about money, how to deploy any technology or product. If you look at, M-Pesa, for instance, someone who was not on the ground there, I'm sure could not have implemented M-Pesa. And we need to think in that way. When we do work in Dubai, for instance, right, we sit down with every single entity in the government and try to help them understand how to move forward. And we need to construct governance mechanisms that are manifested in the blockchain technology that we build that map onto the culture, that make sure that, if a government office, if there are 3 government offices that need to sign off on something, and the dynamic of power between them is this, or the dynamic of signing off is this, we need to make sure that we reflect that in the technology that we build. So I think that there's a lot of nuance, and in some sense, blockchain is an open fabric. It's an open framework for implementing almost any kind of trust model or agreement model or contract model that you can imagine. And you just need to go and understand exactly what that group of people needs to serve their interests and reflect that in the technology.
Yeah, I think it's like any business that goes to a foreign jurisdiction. You need to, ideally, you work with a local partner, you do your research, you go humbly with a lot of humility, and understand the local customs and culture before you try to extend whatever your business idea is or franchise it into that community. But I actually think that in many emerging markets in particular, you actually jump some hurdles, because in many markets, the absence of a traditional, really robust, banking system or currency system is something that you're not battling against. There are no preconceptions about what that should look like. So in many cases, adoption is more natural in some of those communities and cultures. But again, I think the key is what my colleagues have said, which is to really go with humility.
That's a great point about emerging markets. And when you say leapfrog, if people aren't familiar with that term, I think the cell phone networks are a great example of that, where the U.S. and certain other economies literally spent billions of dollars. I'm not sure what the number is, but a large amount of money laying tons and tons at a country-sized scale of copper wire in order to affect the telephone and communication networks. Whereas in emerging markets, they didn't have that. They didn't even try to build anything until cell phone and wireless technology existed. It was dramatically less costly, and it dramatically increased economic activity because of that, and for almost no cost relative to the amount of copper. And I think you could see that dynamic play out over and over again, especially with this technology, where maybe the governance in order to affect a company doesn't exist. Maybe the banking infrastructure doesn't exist, and this technology is nearly free relative to building that. So I think we'll see that dynamic over and over again.
And also, how do you pick your government partners? Because there's just so many places in the world where you can say like, hey, we can use blockchain here to create more global inclusion. But I imagine with all those choices, like there must be a lot of different factors that you look at to pick kind of the right pilot. So how do you do that?
For us, it's actually fairly straightforward because we don't work from the top down. We actually work from the bottom up. So we go directly into communities and almost airdrop this currency into the group or the demographic that we want to work with. And using money is actually fairly intuitive to most people. And how to trade fairly amongst each other within the community is fairly intuitive. The part that's hard, and this is the unique thing about money, is that it must work across communities and it must be liquid, sort of interoperable across many pilots like this. So that's where we went back to kind of the smart contracts and the new technologies that blockchain brings us and worked on it from that layer.
So for ours, the ZEDI Special Economic Zone frameworks have actually been being worked on for the better part of a decade. They actually changed the Honduran constitution to allow for these special economic zones to be implemented. And so it was the place to work if we wanted the 80 to 90% delegation of rulemaking and sovereignty within these types of things. You have that parent company saying, or parent country saying, we want to be able to create prosperity within our country, and we want to bring those governance institutions where the lack of them aren't there. So it's this revolutionary framework to do something like that and allow for 80 to 90% of the rules and regulations to be written by the people that are going to do it there.
Yeah. And at WEF, it's a bit different. I mean, governments come to us and try to convince us that they really want to support the adoption of blockchain. And so part of what we see as our role is really pushing on some of that and asking some of the fundamental questions. And I think we ask everything from cultural adoption questions and things like that, but also the grid, like just things like that. Like how prepared are you to actually invest in your grid if that's necessary? Things like that I think are important, just sort of threshold questions, infrastructure questions.
I think similarly to Sheila and the World Economic Forum, I don't know if we'd never needed to choose per se. A lot of governments approach us. We work with a lot of governments. I mentioned our work in Dubai. We just did an interesting identity project with the government in Switzerland. We've done some work in Brazil and in Singapore as well. And I think most governments are curious about this. ConsenSys, obviously, we're rapidly expanding and growing and trying to serve all of the need that we see. Because for us, the more governments understand this technology and the more they use it to enhance their operations and the more that they adopt it, the better. ConsenSys very much views blockchain and Ethereum as being a substrate of a new global economy, so that the more we can do that, the better. If anyone is from any government out there that is not working on blockchain that wants to, please let us know because we would love to help you.
So one other thing that we discussed when we did our pre-panel phone call was some different kind of environmental applications here. And I do know, because I used to think a lot about this stuff, was I think there are some people who think, oh, here we have, with capitalism, we have problems like tragedy of the commons, and there's all these kind of environmental issues that have arisen from the way that our current economic systems work. And I do know there's a whole bunch of new tokens out there that are trying to, for instance, lower greenhouse gas emissions and have other sort of environmental goals. So can some of you talk about some of the environmental projects that you're working on?
Absolutely. With ours, because we're kind of creating a new jurisdiction, we want it to be a sustainable jurisdiction. We want the energy production to be sustainable. And we have the values that we have are restorative environmental, not just protecting. So whenever we go in there, we want to create systems that are not only sustainable, but actually restore and maintain things that may have been damaged. So one of the things that we're working on is there's a way to generate power through algae farms, offshore algae farms. They also cool the water temperature, protect the coral reefs that are down in the area, as well as take in some of the waste from the city, from the city there, and be able to produce business to be able to produce genetically modify the algae to produce things that we may need in that sense. as well as the energy grid. Like, if you were going to create your own jurisdiction, a new place with a new charter city or new something, you're not going to have a coal power plant, right? It's just not going to happen. You're probably not going to have internal combustion engine cars in that area because we have technologies that can leapfrog that. So with ours, we're going to do, we don't need roads. We're going to have flying autonomous drone vehicles that can take you from one place to another. And it sounds futuristic, but Lilium is a partner doing it. They're doing it in Dubai now, I believe, a little bit. And so we can create sustainable things that restore the environment and ensure to incentivize those types of restorative projects.
So ConsenSys, we have a few environmentally oriented projects. Obviously, the ethos of ConsenSys, as I've described a little bit, as I'm sure people realize, is very forward-looking and very interested in the future of our world. And so it's very in line with our thinking to support projects like that. We have a project called Viridium, which is seeking to essentially tokenize and buy swaths of rainforest and to make sure that the economic value of that, the externalities that are normally pushed onto things like the rainforest to absorb carbon, actually could be incentivized or could be given an economic constraint around it. We think that makes the world better. It raises awareness around how our environment is linked to our economy. We also have a project called CarbonX, which allows the trading of carbon credits. Because we also believe that the more people can be exposed to that, the more types of economic activity that are exposed to that, the more that we can involve the world economically in the state of the environment. And then finally, we have a project called Grid Plus that you may have heard about. Grid Plus is seeking to basically offer incentivization for renewable energy. So every project that we've done around ConsenSys or around energy always has a component about encouraging renewables or encouraging awareness of sort of carbon in the environment and the economy. So all wonderful projects and very much part of our aim.
So something else I wanted to ask about the global inclusive economy is that we have seen so far with blockchains that many of the central players, at least, or kind of the stars of this world are white men. Many of the big holders of crypto tokens are also white men. And here we are talking about the global inclusive economy. And I love this conference because it is so diverse. I've definitely noticed that at the New York one and also today. But how do you guys think we can kind of shift things? Because it almost feels like, at least for the start of this, that we're sort of recreating the world that we have and trying to get to this vision of an inclusive economy is quite far from where we are today.
So, I mean, with ours, and it's going to massively benefit the people of Roatan and Honduras, especially creating more different types of jurisdictions down there that can go and find out what the community needs in terms of governance applications, create innovation hubs for different types of technologies to be brought in and taught to the greater community. That educational portion is really important, and on the ground creating change for those communities and giving and teaching these technologies is important. So there's a lot of people that the white men kind of thing, I understand that, but as much as we can distribute these types of technologies and zone for prosperity and those things, we want to bring as many people into the community as possible.
For us, we see that when you let anyone make money, actually make the money, you're going to see a tremendous amount of diversity in what kind of money is actually made. So you can imagine a variety of different communities that you might be a part of, like Burner Coin or Mother's Coin or Vegan Coin or Surfer's Coin or Soma Coin. You can imagine tokens that represent real communities that real people are really a part of. And what you get there is actually, to touch a little bit on the environmental question from before, is you get a decentralization also of consumerism, right? So when you have a token within your community, you might be much more likely to buy homemade goods that are made from someone in your community rather than going to Walmart or CVS and buying a lot of kind of chemically mass-produced products that we don't really need. If someone in your neighborhood makes a great face cream out of olive oil or whatnot, that might become the new normal for a lot of communities, and you see a lot of very diverse interests being represented when you do it that way.
And what does that mean, like surfer's coin or vegan coin? Like, why would those groups need a coin?
Yeah, so essentially you can draw a circle around your network, whatever your network is, and you might be a member of a variety of networks, and you can say within this circle of people, and it's not a physical circle, right? It can be online, it can be an affinity group. Within this group, this is our currency. It could be sand, but since we have this digital tool, we'll make it a token, we'll put it on the blockchain, it will be decentralized, it will be trustless and thus trusted. And within this community, we'll offer goods and services to each other, we'll be in collaboration. We don't need to all go work outside of the community for the national money in order to meet our needs. We can collaborate internally.
And I think it gets back to the first thing that I said, which is intentionality. We have an opportunity at this moment with this technology to avoid the historic curve we've seen in so many industries where things curve towards the needs of Western societies, the white male, the gays, the economy, like in all those ways. It happens over and over and over again. We've seen it happen over and over again. And we know better, and we have the opportunity to not do that. But it requires intentionality by every single person involved in this ecosystem. Intentionality in hiring, when you're building your applications, taking the cycles to think through the use cases. Like who are you actually building this for? What communities are you including and excluding by the way that you're thinking about what your processes? All those things matter, and we have a chance to not infuse this ecosystem with the same problems that so many other ecosystems have faced.
So from the perspective of ConsenSys as well, we have people in 23 countries. We have a lot of employees. It's always been part of our strategy and our thought that, as I was saying before, if you try to go in, try to build a technology by, white men in New York City, and then you go to another country where people think and act and are culturally completely differently and try to give it to them, it doesn't work so well. So, we believe that having people that work with us, the markets that we operate in, should be extremely diverse. In fact, if we're going to realize the vision of ConsenSys, which is building a new substrate for a global economy and providing the tools to do that, there's no way that we could do that without an incredible diversity of opinion and experience on the part of the people building that. So that's one answer. The other thing that comes to mind is that I think it's really interesting that white papers and tokens and different ways of creating and administrating and providing the economic backing to various projects. In a way, it sort of removes a little bit of the self-reinforcing feedback loop of the way that companies are traditionally financed. People can go on the internet and come up with a great idea and demonstrate the validity of their idea, and then they can go launch a token around it. To some extent, I think nobody cares what you look like or where you're from if your idea is good. And I think that's a really beautiful element of what's happening in this community right now.
And yet, when I look at often the teams, they typically aren't super diverse. I don't know if anybody else has had that experience.
We've had that experience as well. I want to re-echo what Sheila said about intentionality. I think it's so important to remember that technology is amoral. It's morally agnostic, right? It's just a tool, and it's still up to us to endow these tools with the kind of morality we want to see. So blockchain isn't good or bad, and governments aren't good or bad, and regulation isn't good or bad. It's how we apply those tools to society and what intentionality we put behind them that's really going to define where we're going. And including in the investment environment in this space, you see, these crypto whales, which I assume is what you're talking about, and probably many of them are white males, or let's say males. I don't know if they're white, maybe. But these guys, when you're investing in a project and you hope to see 30% or 100% returns in a week or in a day or in 24 hours, ask yourself what kind of economy you're contributing to and if that's what we want to build. And I hope we'll see something much more diverse this time around.
Yeah, Will, do you guys have any ideas on that? Because I do get a sense a lot of these buyers are white men too. I don't know.
There's a lot of people coming up that were in Silicon Valley now that are a lot of white males that are starting to build things. On the other hand, there's a massive amount of people all around the world in China, in Korea, in Japan, building on top of the internet of money that are not white males, that are entrepreneurs of every race and delegation. We tend to see a lot of the ones that are in the United States and in Europe, which have a lot of white men in it. But there's amazing entrepreneurs entering into this space from all over the world and building their projects and creating the hubs for the people to come jam and come work on their projects from all around the world is the way to create those intentional communities. And it doesn't matter where you're from, it matters what your ideas are and what your values are. Kind of the Burning Man ethos, if you will.
I would actually say that Silicon Valley itself has been the most disrupted and kind of decentralized in this current wave that we're seeing with crypto adoption. I grew up here. I grew up in Palo Alto. I've raised money from venture capitalists my whole career. And with Bancor, we barely spent any time here, and we're not here that often. The audience for these projects really is truly global. So maybe it's still quite white and maybe it's still quite male, but there's definitely movement happening.
Definitely super male, I would say. All right, so we literally have like 1 minute. Does someone want to shout out a really interesting question? Go ahead. A woman.
Well, your question would have been mine. So I'm going to ask you a question. What's your idea to change it? I mean, I think you asked the panelists, and I'm not sure they totally hacked at it. I think they gave indications where they saw hope.
Well, you're putting me on the spot.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
It's a really important question, and you're observing it.
All right, I'm going to run down the clock. No, okay, so what are my ideas on this? Gosh. Okay, so I want all of you after this conference, I want you all to tell your female friends and other like underrepresented groups about blockchain and get them excited. So we can start with you. I feel like you put me in the spot and I'm like flailing.
I think we're doing it already, I'll be honest. I think that just having conversations like this, having women on stage, I know ConsenSys made a big effort with this, creating an environment that feels welcoming, that feels inviting, that feels appreciative, that feels respectful, I think is a really big step forward.
Yeah, and I do have to say, which I'm sure many of you are aware, that women do get harassed a lot on social media, and as a woman in the space, I can tell you that that is true. So if you see something going on and you think it's not right, like feel free to speak up, or I actually prefer maybe if you don't feed the trolls, if you just like write a positive comment to something where you notice there's a lot of negative comments, then I think those people feel less comfortable seeing the more harassing things. So that's like something that I've asked a number of friends to do. I tweeted like a joke the other day. Oh shoot, the time's up, but I'll just tell this quickly. I saw there was like some discussion around inclusion, and I noticed the 4 discussion leaders were men, and I just thought it was funny that like that was one of the goals of the talk, but then they, and you wouldn't believe, I did get a lot of likes on the comment, but I also got a lot of harassers, and I was a little bit like, oh, I didn't even realize I was saying something super crazy. But anyway, so yeah, if you see something like that, like feel free to write a positive comment and just give your support, and then I feel like maybe those people don't feel comfortable making nasty remarks. So, all right, thanks guys.